The bullet missed Caleb Morrison's head by 3 inches, and as he dove behind the water trough in front of the Silver Spur Saloon, he made a promise to himself that if he survived this particular Tuesday afternoon in Abilene, Kansas, he would never let another human being get close enough to make him care whether he lived or died. It was August 1876, and the cattle town was at the height of its wild season, with drovers flooding in from the Kishome Trail with money burning holes in their pockets and tempers as hot as the prairie sun. Caleb pressed his back against the rough wood, his Colt .45 gripped tight in his right hand, and listened to the chaos of shouting men and the thunder of boots on the wooden boardwalk. The shooter was Dutch Morgan's youngest brother, a hothead named Pete who believed Caleb had cheated him at cards the night before. Caleb had not cheated, but he had won, and in a town where pride mattered more than truth, that distinction made little difference. "Come out, Morrison." Pete hollered, his voice cracking with rage and whiskey. "Face me like a man." Caleb peered around the edge of the trough and saw Pete standing in the middle of Texas Street, his gun hand shaking but his eyes fixed on the spot where Caleb had taken cover. A small crowd had gathered on both sides of the street, some ducking into doorways, others watching with the morbid fascination of people who had seen too many gunfights to be properly scared anymore. Caleb could end this with a single shot. Pete was exposed, drunk, and foolish. But killing a man, even in self-defense, came with complications Caleb had no interest in dealing with. He had killed before, 3 times to be exact, and each time it had cost him something he could not quite name but felt the absence of nonetheless. "Pete, you are drunk and you are wrong," Caleb called out, keeping his voice steady and reasonable. "I won that money fair, you know it. Your brother knows it. Every man in that saloon knows it. You are a liar and a cheat." Pete fired again, the bullet splintering the wood above Caleb's head. Caleb muttered a curse and considered his options. He could stay put and hope the marshal showed up before Pete ran out of ammunition or patience. He could try to talk the fool down, though that seemed unlikely given Pete's current state. Or he could do what he did best, which was to move fast and end the threat before it escalated further. He chose the third option not because he wanted to, but because staying still had never been in his nature. Caleb rolled to his left, came up in a crouch, and fired a single shot that struck Pete's gun hand. The younger man yelped and dropped his weapon, clutching his bleeding fingers as he stumbled backward and landed hard in the dusty street. Caleb stood and walked toward him, his gun still raised, his expression grim. "That was stupid, Pete. Stupid and pointless. Now get yourself to the doctor before you bleed out, and when you are sober, think about whether your pride was worth losing your trigger finger." Pete glared up at him with tears of pain and humiliation streaming down his face, but said nothing. 2 of his friends rushed forward to help him up, shooting Caleb dark looks, but making no move to continue the fight. The crowd began to disperse, the entertainment over, and Caleb holstered his gun and turned toward the livery stable where his horse was waiting. He had been planning to spend another few days in Abilene, but that plan no longer seemed wise. Men like Pete had brothers and friends who did not always think clearly when it came to matters of revenge. He was halfway to the stable when a voice called out behind him. "That was some fine shooting, mister." Caleb turned and saw Marshal Tom Hardened standing on the boardwalk outside his office, thumbs hooked in his belt, a toothpick dangling from the corner of his mouth. Harden was a tall man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen everything twice and were not impressed by any of it. "Just defending myself, Marshal," Caleb said. "I saw. Still, you have a knack for finding trouble, Morrison. This is the second incident this week involving you. The first one was not my fault either. That cowpoke tried to steal my horse." "True enough," Harden said, shifting the toothpick to the other side of his mouth. "But fault does not much matter when bullets start flying. I am not running you out of town, but I would not be broken-hearted if you decided to move along voluntarily." Caleb nodded slowly. "I was already planning on it, Marshal. I will be gone within the hour." Probably for the best, Hardened said, then tipped his hat and went back inside. Caleb continued to the stable, paid the boy who had been looking after his horse, a solid chestnut gelding named Red, and saddled up. He had no particular destination in mind, which was how he preferred it. For the past 6 years, since the war ended and he returned home to find his family farm burned and his parents dead from fever, he had been drifting. He worked odd jobs, broke horses, hired on as a ranch hand when he needed the money, and moved on before anyone could expect him to stay. He had learned that staying meant caring and caring meant losing, and he had lost enough. As he rode out of Abilene, heading west toward the open grasslands that stretched all the way to Colorado, he thought about the promise he had made to himself behind that water trough. Never marry. Never settle. Never give anyone the power to hurt him the way he had been hurt before. It was a good promise, a smart promise, and he intended to keep it. 3 weeks later, Caleb found himself in a small town called Cottonwood Springs, nestled in the shadow of the Rockies in western Kansas, not far from the Colorado border. The town was smaller than Abilene, quieter, with a single main street lined with a general store, a blacksmith, a church, a modest hotel, and a saloon that looked like it had seen better days. Caleb had stopped because Red needed new shoes and he needed supplies, and Cottonwood Springs seemed as good a place as any to spend a day or two before moving on. He left Red with the blacksmith, a broad-shouldered man named Ike, who promised to have the horse ready by the following afternoon, and walked across the street to the general store. A bell jingled as he pushed open the door, and he stepped into the cool, dim interior that smelled of coffee, leather, and sawdust. The store was well-stocked considering the town's size, with shelves of canned goods, barrels of flour and sugar, bolts of fabric, tools, and rope hanging from hooks on the walls. "Be right with you," a woman's voice called from the back room. Caleb nodded even though she could not see him and began gathering what he needed. Coffee, beans, bacon, ammunition, and a new shirt since his current one had a bullet hole in the shoulder from an incident he preferred not to dwell on. He was examining a sturdy blue work shirt when the woman emerged from the back room carrying a crate of canned peaches. She was not what he expected. Caleb had seen many women in his travels, from dance hall girls with painted faces to farm wives worn down by hard work and harder lives. But this woman was different in a way he could not immediately define. She was young, perhaps 23 or 24, with dark auburn hair pinned up in a practical style that still managed to look elegant. Her dress was simple, a green calico that had been mended in places but was clean and well-fitted. She had a narrow waist, strong shoulders, and moved with the efficiency of someone who knew how to work. But it was her face that made Caleb forget what he had been about to do. She had high cheekbones, a straight nose, and a mouth that looked like it smiled often. Her eyes were the color of honey in sunlight, and when she looked up and saw him standing there, those eyes widened slightly, and then she smiled. It was not a flirtatious smile or a practiced one. It was genuine, warm, and unguarded, the kind of smile that suggested she was simply happy to see another human being on what had probably been a long, uneventful day. And in that moment, as her smile lit up her face and transformed her from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful, Caleb felt something inside him shift and crack like ice breaking up on a river in spring. His promise, the one he had made to himself in Abilene and had reinforced 100 times since, the promise to never let anyone matter enough to hurt him, began to fall apart. "Good afternoon," she said, setting the crate down on the counter. "I am sorry to keep you waiting." "I did not hear you come in at first." Caleb realized he was staring and forced himself to look away, focusing on the shirt in his hands. "No trouble, ma'am, I just need a few supplies." "Of course. Just bring everything up to the counter when you are ready." She began unpacking the cans of peaches, arranging them neatly on a shelf. Caleb gathered the rest of his items, trying to ignore the way his heart was beating faster than it should, and the fact that he kept glancing over at her when he thought she was not looking. This was ridiculous. He was 30 years old, a grown man who had survived a war, gunfights, and 6 years of hard living on the frontier. He should not be rattled by a woman's smile, but he was. He brought his purchases to the counter and watched as she tallied them up, her fingers quick and sure. "You are new in town," she said, not quite making it a question. "Just passing through," Caleb said. "My horse needed shoeing." "Ike does good work. You are in capable hands." She looked up at him again, and there was that smile. "That will be $4.35. Caleb paid her, and as she counted out his change, he found himself searching for a reason to prolong the conversation. "Is there a decent place to eat in town?" The hotel serves meals in the evening. The food is plain but honest. Mrs. Kelly does the cooking, and she has a good hand with roast chicken. She paused, then added, "If you are looking for something stronger to drink, the saloon is across the street, but I warn you it is not much to speak of." "I appreciate the advice, ma'am." He picked up his supplies, hesitated, then asked, "Do you run this store by yourself?" "I do now," she said, and something in her tone suggested a story behind those words. "It belonged to my father. He passed away last winter." "I am sorry for your loss. Thank you." She smiled again, though this time there was sadness in it. "I am Grace Donnelly, by the way. Since you will be in town for a day or two, it seems only proper we should be introduced." "Caleb Morrison," he said, and felt foolish for not having offered his name sooner. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Miss Donnelly." "Miss," she raised an eyebrow. "How did you know I was not married? You are not wearing a ring, and you run the store yourself. I assumed." "You assumed correctly." She tilted her head slightly, studying him with an expression that was curious but not forward. "And what about you, Mr. Morrison? Are you married?" The question caught him off guard, and he found himself answering more honestly than he intended. "No, ma'am, I am not. I have no plans to be either." "Is that so?" There was amusement in her voice. "You sound very certain." "I am," Caleb said firmly, as much to remind himself as to inform her. "I am a drifter, Miss Donnelly. I do not stay anywhere long enough to put down roots, and marriage requires roots." "I suppose it does," Grace said thoughtfully. "Though I have known people who married and still drifted together, love does not always require staying in one place." "Maybe not," Caleb conceded, "but it requires commitment, and I am not the committing kind." Grace laughed, a light, genuine sound that made something in Caleb's chest tighten. "Well, Mr. Morrison, I admire a man who knows his own mind, even if I think he might be wrong." Before Caleb could respond to that, the door opened and a woman in her 50s bustled in, talking before she even crossed the threshold. "Grace, dear, I need 3 yards of that blue fabric you showed me last week, and do you have any more of that lye soap? Mine is nearly gone, and I have a mountain of laundry to do before Sunday." "Of course, Mrs. Henderson," Grace said smoothly, turning her attention to the new customer. She glanced back at Caleb with an apologetic smile. "Thank you for your business, Mr. Morrison. I hope you enjoy your stay in Cottonwood Springs, however brief it may be." Caleb tipped his hat to both women and left the store, stepping out into the bright afternoon sunshine. He stood on the boardwalk for a moment, his supplies in his arms, and tried to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over him. It was just a smile, he told himself. Just a pretty woman being friendly to a customer. It meant nothing, and it would not change anything. He would get his horse shoed, rest for a day, and then move on, just as he always did. But as he walked to the hotel to secure a room, he could not stop thinking about the warmth in Grace Donnelly's eyes or the way she had looked at him like he was someone worth knowing. That evening, Caleb ate dinner in the hotel's small dining room, which consisted of 4 tables covered with checkered cloths and a chalkboard on the wall listing the day's offerings. The roast chicken was as good as Grace had promised, and Mrs. Kelly, a plump woman with kind eyes and flour permanently dusted on her apron, kept his coffee cup filled without being asked. There were only 3 other guests: a traveling salesman who talked too much about his wares, an elderly couple who ate in silence, and Caleb, who preferred it that way. After dinner, he went to his room, a simple space with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that overlooked the main street. He lay on the bed, fully clothed, his hands behind his head, and stared at the ceiling. He should have been planning his next move, deciding whether to head north toward Cheyenne or south toward Santa Fe. Instead, he kept replaying his conversation with Grace Donnelly, turning over her words like a man examining a gold nugget to see if it was real. "I think he might be wrong," she had said. Wrong about what? About marriage, about commitment. About himself. Caleb sat up, irritated with the direction of his thoughts. He pulled off his boots, washed his face in the basin, and lay back down, determined to sleep. But sleep was slow to come, and when it finally did, he dreamed of auburn hair and honey-colored eyes, and a smile that felt like sunlight after a long, cold winter. The next morning, Caleb told himself he was going to the general store only because he needed more coffee. He had bought some the day before, but he had forgotten to get enough, and a man could not travel without a decent supply of coffee. It was a reasonable excuse, and he almost believed it. Grace was behind the counter when he walked in, and when she saw him, her face lit up with another one of those smiles that made his resolve waver. "Mr. Morrison, I did not expect to see you again so soon." "I forgot to buy enough coffee yesterday," Caleb said, hoping he sounded casual. "Thought I would remedy that before I leave town." "Of course." She moved to the shelf where the coffee was stored and pulled down a bag. "How much do you need?" "2 pounds should do it." She measured it out, poured it into a cloth sack, and tied it securely. "Will you be leaving today, then?" "That is the plan. My horse should be ready this afternoon." "Where will you go next?" Caleb shrugged. "I have not decided. West, most likely. Maybe Colorado." Grace set the coffee on the counter and leaned against it, her expression thoughtful. "You really do not stay anywhere, do you?" "I told you I was a drifter." "You did. But I confess I find it curious. Most people want a place to call home, a community, people who know them. You seem to actively avoid all of that." Caleb felt the familiar defensiveness rising in his chest. "Not everyone is cut out for that kind of life, Miss Donnelly." "I suppose not," she said gently. "But it seems lonely." It was lonely, but Caleb had long ago decided that lonely was safer than the alternative. He did not say this, though. Instead, he asked, "What about you? Do you plan to stay in Cottonwood Springs for the rest of your life?" "I do," Grace said without hesitation. "This is my home. My father built this store from nothing, and I intend to keep it going. This town may be small, but it is a good place, and the people here are good people. I cannot imagine living anywhere else." "You have never wanted to see what is beyond the horizon." "Oh, I have wondered," Grace admitted, "but wondering and wanting are different things. I am content here, Mr. Morrison. I have work that matters, people who care about me, and a life that feels meaningful. That is more than many people can say." Caleb could not argue with that. He paid for the coffee, and as he turned to leave, Grace said, "Mr. Morrison, there is a social at the church tonight. Nothing fancy, just music and dancing and a bit of food. If you are still in town, you would be welcome to attend." Caleb hesitated. Every instinct told him to decline, to get on his horse and leave Cottonwood Springs as quickly as possible before whatever was happening between him. And this woman went any further. But when he looked at Grace, at the hopeful expression on her face and the kindness in her eyes, he found himself saying, "What time does it start?" 7 o'clock. "The church is at the end of the street. You cannot miss it." "I will think about it," Caleb said, which was not a yes but was not a no either. Grace smiled, and it was clear she understood the game. "I hope to see you there." Caleb left the store, his heart pounding and his mind racing. He was a fool. He was breaking his own rules, letting himself be drawn in by a pretty face and a warm smile, and it would end badly just like everything else in his life that had ever mattered. He should collect his horse, ride out of town, and never look back. But when 7 o'clock came, Caleb found himself walking toward the church, freshly washed and wearing the new blue shirt he had bought the day before. The church was a simple white building with a small steeple and a bell that someone had rung to signal the start of the social. Lanterns hung from hooks on the walls, casting a warm, golden light over the gathering. There were maybe 40 people there, families and couples, and a handful of young men and women who looked like they were hoping to find someone special. A fiddle player and a man with a guitar sat in the corner, playing a lively tune, and several couples were dancing in the open space in front of the altar. Caleb stood just inside the doorway, feeling out of place and wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. Then Grace appeared at his side as if she had been watching for him. "You came," she said, and the delight in her voice made the risk feel almost worth it. "I said I would think about it," Caleb replied. "I thought about it," Grace laughed. "I am glad your thinking led you here. Come, let me introduce you to some people." Before Caleb could protest, she took his arm and led him into the crowd. She introduced him to the minister, Reverend Clayton, a soft-spoken man with silver hair and a firm handshake, to Mrs. Kelly, who remembered him from the hotel, to the blacksmith Ike and his wife, a cheerful woman named Mary, and to at least a dozen other townspeople whose names Caleb tried and mostly failed to remember. Everyone was friendly, curious about the stranger in their midst but not intrusive, and Caleb found himself relaxing despite his reservations. When the fiddler struck up a waltz, Grace turned to him with a hopeful expression. "Do you dance, Mr. Morrison?" "Not well," Caleb admitted, "but I know the basics. That is all you need." She held out her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, he took it. Dancing with Grace Donnelly was nothing like the clumsy reels Caleb had stumbled through at army camps or the awkward shuffles with dance hall girls who were paid to pretend they enjoyed it. Grace moved with natural grace, her hand light in his, her eyes never leaving his face. She did not chatter or flirt, she simply smiled and followed his lead even when he stumbled over his own feet. "You are better at this than you claimed," she said as the music swelled. "You are just a good partner," Caleb replied, surprised to find it was true. They danced 2 more songs, and with each one, Caleb felt the walls he had built around himself crumbling a little more. It terrified him and exhilarated him in equal measure. When the music finally paused and the musicians took a break, Grace led him outside to the front steps of the church where the air was cooler and the stars were just beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. "Thank you for coming tonight," Grace said, sitting down on the steps and smoothing her skirt. "I know this is not the sort of thing you are accustomed to." Caleb sat beside her, leaving a respectable distance between them. "What makes you say that?" "You have the look of a man who is used to being alone," Grace said simply, "and you hold yourself like you are always ready to leave." "That is because I am always ready to leave." Why? The question was direct, and Caleb appreciated that. He considered lying or deflecting, but something about the quiet darkness and Grace's steady presence made him want to tell the truth. "I lost my family during the war. My parents, my younger sister. When I came home, everything was gone. I realized then that caring about people, about places, only leads to pain. It is easier to keep moving." Grace was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "I lost my mother when I was 12 and my father last winter. I know what grief feels like, Mr. Morrison. But I also know that running from it does not make it hurt any less. It just makes you lonely." "Maybe," Caleb said. "But lonely is something I can handle. Losing someone I love again, I do not think I could survive that." Grace turned to look at him, her face shadowed in the dim light. "So your solution is to never love anyone again, to drift through life without connection or purpose?" "I have a purpose. I stay alive, I take care of myself, that is enough." "Is it, though?" Grace asked gently. "Because you do not look like a man who is content, Mr. Morrison. You look like a man who is afraid." The words hit Caleb like a punch to the gut because they were true. He was afraid, deeply and profoundly afraid, and he had been for 6 long years. He stood abruptly, needing to put distance between himself and this woman who saw too much. "I should go," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Thank you for the evening, Miss Donnelly." Grace stood as well, and though she did not reach for him, he could feel her concern like a physical thing. I am sorry if I overstepped. I have a bad habit of saying what I think." "You did not overstep," Caleb said, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "You were right, but that does not change anything." He walked away before she could respond, striding quickly down the street toward the hotel. His hands were shaking, and he clenched them into fists, angry at himself for letting his guard down, for letting Grace Donnelly get close enough to see the truth he had been hiding from everyone, including himself. Back in his room, Caleb paced like a caged animal. He should leave tonight. Red's shoes were done, and he could be miles away by dawn. But even as he thought it, he knew he would not go. Not yet. Not without seeing Grace one more time. He slept poorly that night, and when morning came, he made a decision that went against every instinct he had honed over the past 6 years. He was going to stay in Cottonwood Springs for a few more days. Not because he was changing his mind about marriage or settling down, but because he wanted to understand what it was about Grace Donnelly that had shaken him so thoroughly. Maybe if he spent more time with her, the spell would break, and he could leave with his resolve intact. It was flawed logic, and somewhere deep down, Caleb knew it. But he told himself the lie anyway, because the alternative was admitting that he was already halfway to falling in love with a woman he had known for less than 2 days. Over the next week, Caleb found reasons to stay in Cottonwood Springs. He helped Ike repair a broken wagon wheel. He did odd jobs around the hotel in exchange for reduced rates. He played cards with some of the local men and won enough to keep himself fed without dipping too deeply into his savings. And every day, he found an excuse to stop by the general store. Sometimes he bought things he needed. Sometimes he bought things he did not need. Sometimes he just stood outside and watched through the window as Grace helped customers, her movements efficient and graceful, her smile never faltering. He told himself he was just passing the time, but the truth was harder to ignore with each day that passed. He was falling for her, and he did not know how to stop it. Grace, for her part, seemed to accept his presence without question. She was friendly but not forward, warm but not demanding. She told him stories about the town and its people, about her father and the store and her plans to expand the inventory once she saved enough money. She asked him about his travels, and though Caleb was careful not to reveal too much, he found himself sharing more than he had with anyone in years. One afternoon, nearly 10 days after he had first arrived in Cottonwood Springs, Grace closed the store early and invited Caleb to walk with her to a spot along the nearby creek where wildflowers grew in thick clusters. It was a beautiful place, peaceful and secluded, with the sound of water burbling over rocks and the scent of prairie grass carried on the breeze. They sat on a fallen log, watching the play of sunlight on the water, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Then Grace said, "You are still here." "I am," Caleb admitted. Why, he could have lied. He could have said he was waiting for a job or saving money or enjoying the town. But he was tired of lying, tired of pretending he did not feel what he so clearly felt. "Because of you," he said quietly. Grace turned to look at him, her eyes wide and searching. Caleb. It was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it on her lips made something inside him break open. "I know I said I would never marry, that I do not want to settle down, and I meant it when I said it. But then I met you, and everything I thought I knew about myself started to feel wrong." Grace reached out and took his hand, her touch gentle and grounding. "What are you saying?" "I am saying I do not know anymore," Caleb said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I do not know if I can be the kind of man you deserve, Grace. I do not know if I can stay in one place or build a life or be anything other than what I have been for the past 6 years. But I know that when I am with you, I want to try, and that terrifies me." Grace's eyes filled with tears, though she was smiling. "You are not as broken as you think you are, Caleb Morrison. You are just scared, and that is all right. I am scared too." "Scared of what?" Caleb asked, surprised. "Scared that you will leave," Grace said honestly. "Scared that I will let myself care about you and then wake up one morning to find you have moved on. Scared that I am falling in love with a man who does not know how to stay." "You are falling in love with me." The words came out as a whisper, disbelieving and hopeful all at once. Grace nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Yes, I know it is fast, and I know it is probably foolish, but yes, I am falling in love with you." Caleb cupped her face in his hands, his thumb brushing away the tear. "It is not foolish, and it is not one-sided. I am falling in love with you too, Grace. I have been since the moment you smiled at me." They kissed then, slow and sweet and full of all the things neither of them had the words to say. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard, and Caleb rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I do not know what happens now," he said. "Neither do I," Grace replied, "but we will figure it out together." It was a promise and a hope, and a leap of faith all wrapped into one. And as they sat there by the creek with the sun sinking lower in the sky, Caleb allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could have this. He could have her. He could have a future that looked different from the past 6 years of drifting and loneliness. But life, as Caleb had learned the hard way, had a way of complicating even the simplest hopes. 2 days later, trouble arrived in Cottonwood Springs in the form of 3 men on horseback. They rode into town just after noon, their faces hard and their eyes scanning the street like wolves looking for prey. Caleb was at the general store when they arrived, helping Grace stock shelves, and he happened to glance out the window just as they dismounted in front of the saloon. One of them looked familiar, and it took Caleb a moment to place him. Then it hit him like a punch to the gut. It was Dutch Morgan, Pete's older brother, and the 2 men with him were likely part of Dutch's gang. Dutch was known throughout Kansas and Colorado as a cattle rustler and a hired gun, a man who did not forgive slights and did not forget debts. "What is wrong?" Grace asked, noticing the sudden tension in Caleb's posture. "Trouble," Caleb said curtly. "I need to go. Go where?" Grace stepped beside him and looked out the window. "Who are those men?" "Men I had a run-in with a few weeks back. Or rather, I had a run-in with one of their kin. I was hoping it would not follow me here, but it looks like I was wrong." Grace's face paled. "Are they here for you?" "I do not know. Maybe, probably." Caleb grabbed his hat from the counter and headed for the door. "Stay inside, Grace. Lock the door if they come this way." "Caleb, wait." Grace caught his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "You cannot just go out there and confront them alone." "Let me get the marshal." "Cottonwood Springs does not have a marshal," Caleb reminded her. "And I am not going to confront them. I am just going to see what they want and hope it does not involve me." But hope was a fragile thing, and it shattered the moment Caleb stepped outside. Dutch Morgan saw him immediately, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. He said something to his companions, and all 3 of them turned to face Caleb, their hands resting on the butts of their guns. "Well, well," Dutch called out, his voice carrying easily across the street. "If it is not Caleb Morrison, fancy running into you here." Caleb stepped off the boardwalk and walked slowly toward the center of the street, keeping his hands visible and his expression neutral. "Dutch, I heard your brother ran into some bad luck in Abilene. I hope his hand is healing." "His hand is ruined," Dutch said coldly. "Doctors said he will never have full use of it again. Pete was always a fool, but he is still my brother, and you put a bullet in him." "I put a bullet in his gun hand to keep him from putting one in my head," Caleb replied evenly. "He drew first, Dutch." "Every man in Abilene will tell you that." "Maybe so," Dutch said, "but that does not change the fact that you crippled my brother, and in my family we do not let things like that slide." Caleb felt the familiar cold calm settle over him, the same calm he had felt in a dozen other gunfights and dangerous situations. "So what do you want, Dutch? An apology? Money, or are you here to kill me?" Dutch laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Oh, I am here to kill you, Morrison. But I am going to give you a choice. You can face me like a man, right here and now, or you can run and I will hunt you down. Either way, you are a dead man." Caleb heard the door of the general store open behind him and knew, without looking, that Grace had disobeyed his order to stay inside. "Grace, go back inside," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off Dutch. "No," Grace said, her voice shaking but determined. "This is wrong. You cannot just kill a man in the middle of the street." Dutch glanced at her, his expression mildly amused. "And who might you be, sweetheart?" "My name is Grace Donnelly, and this is my town. If you have a grievance, take it up with the law, not with guns." "Pretty little thing is not she," Dutch said to his companions, who chuckled appreciatively. "Tell me, Morrison, is this your woman?" "Because if she is, that makes things a whole lot more interesting." Caleb felt rage flare hot and sudden in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "Leave her out of this, Dutch. This is between you and me." "Oh, I intend to," Dutch said, his smile widening. "But first, I want you to know what you are fighting for. You die here, and I promise you, me and the boys will take real good care of your lady friend." It was a threat, and a taunt designed to make Caleb lose his temper and make a mistake, but Caleb had been in too many fights to fall for it. "You are going to regret saying that, Dutch." "Am I?" Dutch's hand moved toward his gun, and the world seemed to slow down. Caleb drew faster, his Colt clearing the holster in a smooth, practiced motion. He fired once, the bullet striking Dutch in the chest and sending him staggering backward. The two men with Dutch drew their guns, but Caleb was already moving, diving to the side and firing again. One of them went down with a cry, clutching his shoulder. The other got off a shot that kicked up dirt near Caleb's feet, but Caleb's return fire was more accurate, hitting the man in the leg and dropping him. The whole exchange lasted less than 10 seconds. Dutch was on the ground, blood spreading across his shirt, his breathing labored. Caleb walked over and kicked the gun out of his reach, then looked down at him with cold eyes. "You should have let it go, Dutch," Dutch coughed, blood flecking his lips. "You are a dead man, Morrison. My boys will come for you." "Let them," Caleb said. "I will be ready." Dutch's eyes glazed over, and a moment later he was gone. Caleb turned to check on the other two men. The one he had shot in the shoulder was unconscious, and the one with the leg wound was writhing in pain but alive. The townspeople had started to emerge from their hiding places, staring at the scene with a mixture of shock and fear. Grace was at Caleb's side in an instant, her face pale but her hands steady as she gripped his arm. "Are you hurt?" "No," Caleb said, his voice rough. "Are you?" "No." "But Caleb, this is bad. You killed a man and there are witnesses." "He drew first," Caleb said. "Everyone saw that, I know, but—" Grace looked around at the gathering crowd, her worry evident. "What if more of his gang comes looking for you? What if they come after you or this town?" Caleb had been thinking the same thing. Dutch had been the leader, but men like him always had followers, and some of those followers would want revenge. Staying in Cottonwood Springs was no longer an option, not if it meant putting Grace and the townspeople in danger. "I have to leave," Caleb said quietly, "tonight before anyone else shows up." "No," Grace said, her voice fierce. "You are not running, not from this and not from me. Grace, I am trying to keep you safe. And I am trying to keep you from throwing away the only good thing you have had in years," Grace shot back. "We will figure this out, Caleb, together, but you are not leaving." Before Caleb could argue, Reverend Clayton stepped forward, his expression grave. "Miss Donnelly is right, son. Running will not solve anything, and if more of Dutch Morgan's men do come looking for trouble, we will deal with them as a community. This town has faced worse than outlaws, and we are still here." Other townspeople murmured their agreement, and Caleb was surprised by the show of support. He had always thought of himself as an outsider, someone passing through, but these people were claiming him as one of their own. Ike, the blacksmith, stepped forward and clapped Caleb on the shoulder. "You did what you had to do, Morrison. No one here blames you for that. And if Dutch's boys come sniffing around, we will be ready." Caleb looked at Grace, who was watching him with fierce determination and something that looked like love. He thought about his promise, the one he had made in Abilene, and realized it had been a foolish promise born out of fear and pain. Running had not made him stronger or safer, it had just made him alone. "All right," Caleb said finally. "I will stay, but we need to be prepared. If Dutch's gang comes, they will not come alone and they will not come to talk." Over the next few days, Cottonwood Springs transformed into something resembling a fortress. The men of the town, under Caleb's guidance, set up watch posts at the edges of town and organized shifts so that someone was always on guard. Weapons were checked and cleaned, and those who did not own guns borrowed them from neighbors. The women and children were told to stay indoors as much as possible, and the general store became an unofficial headquarters where people gathered to share information and make plans. Grace worked tirelessly alongside Caleb, organizing supplies and rallying the townspeople. She proved to be a natural leader, calm under pressure and quick to find solutions to problems. Caleb found himself admiring her more with each passing day, not just for her beauty or her kindness, but for her strength and resilience. On the third night after the gunfight, as Caleb was making his rounds, Grace found him near the church and handed him a cup of coffee. "You need to rest," she said. "You have been up for nearly 2 days straight." "I will rest when I know everyone is safe," Caleb replied, taking the coffee gratefully. "Stubborn man," Grace said, but there was affection in her voice. She sat down on the church steps, and after a moment Caleb joined her. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the night, the chirp of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. "Do you regret staying?" Grace asked finally. "No," Caleb said without hesitation. "I regret a lot of things in my life, Grace, but staying here is not one of them. Even if Dutch's gang shows up and there is more trouble, even then." Caleb set his coffee aside and took her hand. "I told you I was falling in love with you, and I meant it. I do not know what the future holds, but I know I want to face it with you." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, and he could feel the tension in her body slowly easing. "I love you, Caleb Morrison, and I am not going to let anything happen to you." "I love you too," Caleb said, the words feeling both terrifying and right. "And I am going to do everything in my power to keep you and this town safe." They sat there until dawn, holding each other and drawing strength from their shared resolve. When the sun finally rose, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Caleb felt something shift inside him. For the first time in 6 years, he was not thinking about running. He was thinking about staying, about building a life, about keeping the promises that mattered. But the peace was short-lived. 2 days later, a rider came into town with news that made everyone's blood run cold. A group of 8 men, all known associates of Dutch Morgan, had been seen 20 miles to the east, heading in the direction of Cottonwood Springs. They were heavily armed, and according to the rider, they were asking questions about Caleb Morrison. The town went into high alert. Caleb organized the defenses, positioning the best shots at strategic points and making sure everyone knew their role. Grace and the other women prepared bandages and medical supplies, and Reverend Clayton led a prayer service for those who wanted it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the street, Caleb stood at the edge of town with a rifle in his hands and a grim expression on his face. He could see the dust cloud in the distance, growing closer, and he knew the time for preparation was over. Grace came to stand beside him, her face pale but resolute. "They are coming." "Yes," Caleb said. "Grace, I need you to promise me something, anything. If things go bad, if it looks like we cannot hold them off, I need you to take the women and children and get out of town. Head to the next settlement and do not look back." Grace shook her head. "I am not leaving you, Grace." "No, Caleb. I am not leaving you, and neither is anyone else in this town. We are going to fight, and we are going to win, and then we are going to build the life we talked about. Do you understand?" Caleb looked at her, this fierce, incredible woman who had somehow turned his world upside down, and felt his chest tighten with emotion. "I understand." The riders appeared on the horizon just as the last light was fading from the sky. There were 8 of them, just as the rider had reported, and they came to a halt at the edge of town, surveying the fortified positions and the armed men waiting for them. For a long moment, no one moved. Then one of the riders, a lean man with a scar running down his cheek, spurred his horse forward. "We are looking for Caleb Morrison," the man called out. "Hand him over and the rest of you can go about your business." Caleb stepped forward, his rifle still in his hands. "I am Caleb Morrison. "What do you want?" the scarred man grinned, though there was no humor in it. "You killed Dutch Morgan, that makes you a dead man, but we are reasonable. You come with us peacefully and we will not burn this town to the ground. And if I do not, then we will take you by force and kill anyone who gets in our way." Before Caleb could respond, Ike stepped forward, his shotgun leveled at the riders. "You are not taking anyone anywhere. This man is under our protection, and if you want him, you will have to go through all of us." One by one, the other townspeople stepped forward, forming a line beside Caleb. Old men and young, shopkeepers and farmers, all of them armed and ready to fight. Grace stood at Caleb's side, a rifle in her hands and fire in her eyes. The scarred man looked at the assembled crowd and seemed to recalculate his odds. "You are all fools," he said. "But if you want to die for this drifter, so be it." He raised his hand and the riders drew their guns. What followed was chaos. Gunfire erupted from both sides, the sound deafening in the quiet night. Caleb fired methodically, taking down one rider and then another. Ike's shotgun roared and one of the attackers fell from his horse. The townspeople fought with a desperation born of protecting their homes and their loved ones, and for a few frantic minutes, it seemed like they might actually hold the line. But the outlaws were experienced fighters, and they adapted quickly. Two of them dismounted and took cover behind a water trough, firing at the defenders with deadly accuracy. One of the townspeople, a young man named Ben, cried out and fell, clutching his side. Grace ran to him, dragging him to cover while bullets kicked up dirt around her. Caleb saw the scarred man circling around to the left, trying to flank them and moved to intercept. They exchanged shots, and Caleb felt a bullet graze his arm, a hot line of pain that he ignored. He fired again, and the scarred man went down, clutching his chest. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader fall and their numbers dwindling, began to retreat. They fired a few more shots as they rode away, but it was clear they had lost the stomach for the fight. Within minutes, the street was silent except for the groans of the wounded and the heavy breathing of the defenders. Caleb lowered his rifle and looked around, taking stock of the damage. 3 of the outlaws were dead, and 2 more were wounded and captured. On the town side, Ben was badly hurt but alive, and a few others had minor injuries. It could have been much worse. Grace appeared at his side, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "You are bleeding." Caleb looked down at his arm, surprised to see the blood soaking through his shirt. "It is just a graze, I will be fine." "Let me bandage it," Grace insisted, and Caleb did not have the energy to argue. As she worked, her hands gentle but efficient, Caleb looked around at the townspeople who had fought beside him. They were battered and exhausted, but they were standing. And they were looking at him with something that looked like respect. Reverend Clayton approached, his face grim but relieved. "You did good work tonight, Mr. Morrison. We all did." "It is not over," Caleb said quietly. "There may be more of them." "Then we will deal with them too," Clayton said firmly. "This is our town and we will defend it." Over the next few weeks, life in Cottonwood Springs slowly returned to normal. The wounded healed, including Ben, who recovered with surprising speed thanks to Grace's nursing. The captured outlaws were handed over to the territorial marshal when he arrived to investigate the incident, and word spread that Dutch Morgan's gang had been broken. No more trouble came to Cottonwood Springs, and the townspeople began to relax, though they remained vigilant. Caleb stayed, not because he was still worried about danger, but because he no longer had any desire to leave. He found work as a ranch hand on a spread just outside of town, and when he was not working, he spent his time with Grace. They took long walks by the creek, shared meals at the hotel, and talked about everything and nothing. Slowly, carefully, they built something real and lasting. One evening, as autumn began to settle over the prairie and the air turned crisp, Caleb found himself standing outside the general store, gathering his courage. He had made a decision, one that terrified him and thrilled him in equal measure, and he could not put it off any longer. He walked inside and found Grace closing up for the day. She looked up and smiled when she saw him, and that smile still had the power to make his heart skip a beat. "Caleb, I did not expect you until later. Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine," Caleb said, though his voice was tight with nerves. "I just wanted to talk to you about something." Grace set down the ledger she had been working on and gave him her full attention. "Of course. What is on your mind?" Caleb took a deep breath, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He had ridden to the next town over to buy it, spending nearly all of his savings on the simple gold band inside. "Grace Donnelly, I know I am not much. I am a drifter with a troubled past and more flaws than I can count, but you have changed me in ways I did not think were possible. You have given me hope and purpose and a reason to want to stay in one place. I love you, Grace. I love you more than I thought I could ever love anyone. And I am asking if you will have me, if you would do me the honor of becoming my wife." He opened the box, revealing the ring, and looked at her with a vulnerability he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Grace's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she could not speak. Then she laughed, a joyful, breathless sound, and threw her arms around his neck. "Yes, Caleb. Yes, I will marry you. I love you so much." Caleb held her tight, relief and joy flooding through him in equal measure. "You have made me the happiest man alive, Grace Donnelly." "Soon to be Grace Morrison," she said, pulling back to look at him. "And you have made me the happiest woman." They kissed, and it was sweet and tender and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling through their tears. "I swore I would never marry," Caleb said, shaking his head in wonder. "I was so certain I would spend the rest of my life alone, and then you smiled at me and everything fell apart." "Sometimes falling apart is the best thing that can happen," Grace said, taking his hand. "Because it means you can rebuild into something better." "I think you are right," Caleb agreed, "and I think I am finally ready to do that." The wedding took place 6 weeks later, on a crisp October morning when the leaves were turning gold and the sky was a brilliant, endless blue. Reverend Clayton officiated, and nearly the entire town turned out to witness the ceremony. Grace wore a simple white dress that she had made herself, and Caleb wore his best suit, borrowed from Ike since he did not own one. They stood in the church where they had first danced, their hands clasped, their eyes locked on each other, and spoke vows that were both traditional and deeply personal. "I promise to stay," Caleb said, his voice steady and sure. "I promise to build a life with you, to face whatever comes our way together, and to love you for as long as I draw breath." "I promise to stand by you," Grace replied, her voice soft but unwavering. "I promise to be your partner, your friend, and your love through good times and bad for the rest of our lives." When Reverend Clayton pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in applause and cheers. Caleb kissed his bride, and in that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that he had made the right choice. He had found his home, not in a place but in a person, and he would spend the rest of his life proving himself worthy of her love. The reception was held in the street outside the church, with tables laden with food and drink and the fiddle player from the social providing music. Caleb and Grace danced their first dance as husband and wife, and then they danced with the townspeople, laughing and celebrating until the stars came out and the lanterns were lit. Later that night, in the small house behind the general store that Grace had inherited from her father, Caleb held his wife in his arms and marveled at the turn his life had taken. He had gone from a man determined to be alone to a man who could not imagine life without Grace. It was a transformation he would have thought impossible just a few months earlier, but here he was, happy and content and deeply in love. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked, tracing lazy patterns on his chest. "I am thinking about how lucky I am," Caleb said. "And how grateful I am that you did not give up on me." "I never would have," Grace said. "I knew from the moment I met you that you were worth fighting for, even when I was being stubborn and difficult, especially then," Grace said with a laugh. "You needed someone to see past the walls you had built. I am just glad I was that someone." Caleb kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair. I love you, Grace Morrison. I love you too, Caleb Morrison, and I always will. Life in Cottonwood Springs settled into a comfortable rhythm over the following months. Caleb continued to work at the ranch, earning a reputation as a skilled and reliable hand. Grace ran the general store, expanding the inventory just as she had planned and building a thriving business. Together, they became pillars of the community, hosting dinners, attending church socials, and lending a hand wherever it was needed. In the spring of 1877, Grace discovered she was expecting their first child. Caleb was overjoyed but terrified in equal measure, memories of his lost family resurfacing with unexpected intensity. But Grace, as always, was his anchor, reminding him that fear was natural but that it did not have to define them. "We are going to be wonderful parents," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch of their house, watching the sunset. "And our children are going to grow up knowing they are loved." "I hope so," Caleb said, placing a hand on her still flat stomach. "I want to give them everything I did not have: stability, safety, a home they can count on." "They will have all of that," Grace assured him, "because they will have you." Their son was born on a snowy December morning, a healthy, loud baby with a shock of dark hair and his father's serious eyes. They named him Samuel, after Grace's father, and Caleb held the tiny, squirming bundle with a mixture of awe and terror, unable to believe that this perfect little person was his. "He is beautiful," Grace said from the bed, exhausted but radiant, "just like his father." "He is perfect," Caleb agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "And I promise, Grace, I am going to be the best father I can be. I am never going to let him doubt that he is loved." "I know you will," Grace said, reaching out to take his hand. "You are already the best man I know, Caleb. Our son is lucky to have you." Over the next few years, Caleb proved those words true. He was a devoted father, patient and attentive, always making time to play with Samuel or tell him stories. He taught his son to ride, to fish, to respect the land and the people around him. And when their daughter, Emily, was born 2 years later, Caleb's heart expanded in ways he had not known were possible. Emily was the image of her mother, with auburn hair and honey-colored eyes, and she had Grace's fearless spirit. The general store thrived, and Caleb eventually became a partner in the business, using his savings to help Grace expand into a second building that housed a small cafe. Cottonwood Springs grew slowly but steadily, attracting new families and businesses, and Caleb and Grace were at the heart of it all, respected and loved by everyone who knew them. There were hard times, of course. A drought one summer that nearly broke the town. A winter so harsh that they lost livestock and struggled to keep warm, and moments when Caleb's old fears resurfaced and threatened to pull him under. But Grace was always there, steady and strong, reminding him that they were in this together and that love was stronger than fear. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Caleb surprised Grace with a trip to Denver, leaving the children with Ike and Mary for a week. They stayed in a hotel, ate in fine restaurants, and walked through the city streets hand in hand, marveling at how far they had come from that first meeting in a dusty general store. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked one evening as they sat in their hotel room watching the lights of the city twinkle below. "Giving up the life you had before?" "Never," Caleb said without hesitation. "That was not a life, Grace. It was just existing. You gave me a real life, a purpose, a family." "I would not trade this for anything." Grace smiled and leaned against him. "I am glad, because I could not imagine my life without you." "You will never have to," Caleb promised. "I am here, Grace, and I am not going anywhere." Years passed, and Caleb and Grace watched their children grow into fine young people. Samuel became a rancher, taking over the spread where Caleb had worked and building it into one of the most successful operations in the region. Emily married a schoolteacher and opened the town's first proper school, educating children from all over the county. Caleb and Grace became grandparents, then great-grandparents, their family tree spreading wide and deep. Through it all, their love remained constant. They still took walks by the creek where Caleb had first confessed his feelings. They still danced at church socials, though their steps were slower now. They still held hands and shared quiet moments on their porch, watching the sun set over the prairie. One evening, when they were both well into their 70s, Caleb sat beside Grace on that same porch and took her hand. "Do you remember the day we met?" he asked. "Every detail," Grace said, her voice still strong despite the years. "You walked into my store looking like you wanted to be anywhere else, and then I smiled at you. And my promise fell apart," Caleb finished, smiling at the memory. "Best thing that ever happened to me, to both of us," Grace said. "I love you, Caleb Morrison. I have loved you from the beginning, and I will love you until the end." "And I love you, Grace Morrison. You saved me. You gave me a life worth living. I cannot imagine what I would have become without you." They sat in silence for a while, holding hands and watching the stars come out, content in the knowledge that they had built something beautiful and lasting. A life. A family. A love that had endured through hardship and joy, through fear and hope, through all the years that had passed since a drifter walked into a general store and a woman smiled at him. Caleb had sworn he would never marry, but Grace's smile had changed everything. And as he sat there beside his wife, surrounded by the life they had created together, he knew that breaking that promise had been the best decision he had ever made. In the autumn of 1920, Caleb Morrison passed away peacefully in his sleep, his hand still holding Grace's. He was 74 years old. Grace followed him just 6 months later, unable to imagine a world without the man who had been her partner, her love, and her greatest adventure. They were buried side by side in the cemetery overlooking Cottonwood Springs, their headstones simple but proud, inscribed with their names and the years they had lived. But the story did not end there. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren continued to thrive, carrying forward the legacy of love and resilience that Caleb and Grace had built. The general store remained in the family for 3 more generations, a cornerstone of Cottonwood Springs, and a reminder of the woman who had run it with such grace and determination. The ranch that Samuel built became one of the largest in the state, providing jobs and stability for countless families. And Emily's school educated hundreds of children, many of whom went on to become teachers, doctors, lawyers, and leaders in their own right. In the town of Cottonwood Springs, the story of Caleb and Grace Morrison became legend. It was told to children as a bedtime story, shared between lovers as a testament to the power of love, and remembered by the community as a reminder that even the most broken people could find healing and hope if they were willing to take a chance. And so, the cowboy who swore he would never marry and the woman whose smile changed his life lived on, not just in memory but in the lives they had touched and the love they had left behind. It was a legacy that would endure for generations, a story of redemption, courage, and the transformative power of love in the wild, untamed West. The end came not with sorrow but with celebration, for Caleb and Grace had lived fully and loved deeply, and that was all anyone could ever hope for. They had taken the broken pieces of their lives and forged them into something beautiful, proving that the greatest adventures are not found in drifting but in staying, not in running but in standing firm, and not in building walls but in opening hearts. And in the quiet evenings when the sun set over the prairie and the wind whispered through the grass, the people of Cottonwood Springs could still feel the presence of Caleb and Grace Morrison, 2 souls who had found each other against all odds and had created a love story that would never be forgotten. Their great-great-granddaughter, a spirited young woman named Claire, often visited their graves, bringing fresh wildflowers and sitting quietly between the headstones. She had heard the stories all her life, how Caleb had been a drifter running from his past and how Grace had seen something in him worth saving, how he had sworn never to marry and how her smile had made that promise impossible to keep, how they had fought together, loved together, and built a family that spanned generations. Claire often wondered what it must have been like, to love someone so completely that you would give up everything you thought you believed in for them. She had not yet found that kind of love herself, but she hoped one day she would. And when she did, she would remember her great-great-grandparents and the example they had set. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the town of Cottonwood Springs changed and grew, but the legacy of Caleb and Grace Morrison remained a constant. Their story was taught in schools, written about in local history books, and commemorated with a plaque in the town square that read, "In memory of Caleb and Grace Morrison, who proved that love can heal even the deepest wounds and that home is not a place but a person. May their story inspire generations to come." And it did. Young couples visited their graves and made promises to each other, vowing to love as deeply and as truly as Caleb and Grace had. Families gathered at the old general store, now a museum, to learn about the woman who had run it with such determination, and the man who had found his purpose by her side. And every year, on the anniversary of their wedding, the town held a celebration in their honor, with dancing and music and stories shared late into the night. The Wild West was long gone, replaced by highways and technology, and a world that Caleb and Grace could never have imagined. But the values they had lived by, love, loyalty, courage, and community, remained as relevant as ever. And their story, the story of a cowboy who swore he would never marry and the woman whose smile changed everything, continued to inspire and uplift all who heard it. In the end, it was not the gunfights or the hardships or even the triumphs that defined Caleb and Grace Morrison. It was the simple, profound truth that they had chosen each other every single day, through every challenge and every joy, until death finally parted them. And even then, their love endured, a beacon of hope and a testament to the power of the human heart. For Caleb Morrison, the drifter who had spent 6 years running from his pain, had finally found what he had been searching for all along. Not in the wide-open spaces of the West or in the thrill of danger and adventure, but in the warm, steady presence of a woman named Grace. She had seen past his walls, healed his wounds, and given him a reason to stay. And in return, he had given her his heart, his loyalty, and a love that would last for all eternity. Their story was one of transformation and redemption, of two broken people finding wholeness in each other, and of the courage it takes to let go of fear and embrace love. It was a story that began with a promise broken and ended with a promise kept, the promise to love, to cherish, and to stand together no matter what life brought their way. And as the sun set over the prairie one last time, casting golden light across the cemetery where Caleb and Grace lay side by side, it was easy to imagine them together still, holding hands and watching the horizon, content in the knowledge that they had lived well, loved deeply, and left the world a better place than they had found it. The cowboy and the shopkeeper, the drifter and the dreamer, Caleb and Grace Morrison. Their love story was complete, their legacy secure, and their hearts forever intertwined. And in the quiet, timeless beauty of the West they had called home, their spirits lived on, a reminder to all who came after that true love, the kind that changes lives and lasts forever, is always worth fighting for. And so, the story of Caleb Morrison, the cowboy who swore he would never marry, and Grace Donnelly, the woman whose smile made his promise fall apart, came to a close. But their love, their legacy, and the life they built together would endure for generations, a testament to the power of love, the strength of commitment, and the beauty of two souls finding each other in the vast, wild expanse of the American West. The wild prairies stretched endlessly, the mountains stood tall and proud, and the town of Cottonwood Springs continued to thrive, all of it touched by the love of two people who had dared to believe that happiness was possible, even for the most unlikely of hearts. And in that belief, they had found not just love but a life worth living, a family worth building, and a legacy worth leaving behind. Their story was over, but the love they had shared would never truly end. It lived on in their descendants, in the town they had helped build, and in the hearts of everyone who heard their tale and dared to believe that love, real and true and lasting, was still possible in this world. And perhaps that was the greatest gift Caleb and Grace Morrison left behind, not just the family they had created or the business they had built, but the simple, powerful truth that love can change everything. That a single smile can break down walls built from years of pain. That staying is sometimes braver than running, and that the promises we make to ourselves are only as strong as the people we meet who make us want to break them. Caleb had sworn he would never marry. Then Grace smiled and his promise fell apart. And in falling apart, he found everything he had ever needed, everything he had ever wanted, everything that truly mattered. He found love, he found home, he found grace. And in the end, that was more than enough. It was everything.